The lake lay flat and silver under the November sky, a mirror broken only by the slow drift of mist rising from water still warmer than the air above it. Daniel Reeves stood at the end of the weathered dock, hands in the pockets of his worn canvas jacket, watching his breath cloud in the morning cold. He was 17, tall and angular in the way of boys caught between childhood and something harder, and he had told his mother he'd be back before lunch. The dock creaked beneath his boots as he turned toward the trail that wound through the pines, the same trail generations of families had walked to reach the swimming cove on the far side. It was the last day of deer season, and somewhere in the woods behind him, his father and uncle were tracking a buck they'd spotted at dawn. Daniel had chosen the lake instead, craving the particular silence that comes when you're alone with deep water and trees that have stood longer than anyone can remember. When his mother called the house at 2 that afternoon and got no answer, she felt the first cold thread of worry. By 4, when his father returned empty-handed and Daniel's truck still sat in the gravel drive, that thread became a rope. By nightfall, it was a net that caught the whole town. The search began before the moon rose. Volunteers gathered in the high school parking lot, organizing themselves into groups of 6 with hand-drawn maps and two-way radios that crackled with static and hope. Sheriff Tom Galloway, who had known Daniel since the boy was small enough to ride on his shoulders at the county fair, coordinated the effort with the methodical calm of a man who understood that panic saved no one. They walked grid patterns through the forest, calling Daniel's name until their voices went hoarse, sweeping flashlight beams across tree trunks and underbrush. Canine units arrived from the state capital by midnight, German shepherds straining at their leads as they worked the scent trail from Daniel's bedroom pillow. The dogs led them to the dock, circled twice, and sat down facing the water. Divers went down the next morning, their wetsuited forms disappearing into depths that dropped to 90 feet in the center channel. They found nothing, no clothing, no evidence of struggle, no body caught in the tangle of submerged logs where the old lumber mill had dumped waste decades before. The water gave back only cold and darkness. Daniel's truck yielded no clues beyond the expected. A crumpled gas receipt dated 3 days prior, a library book on civil engineering 2 weeks overdue, and a half-empty bottle of water wedged in the cup holder. His wallet sat on his dresser at home. His phone, they discovered, had been left charging on the kitchen counter that morning, a detail his mother would replay in her mind for years, wondering what it meant, or if it meant anything at all. The first week became 2, then 4. The search perimeter expanded to cover 18 square miles of forest, bog, and shoreline. Hunters reported nothing. Hikers saw no trace. The lake remained silent, its surface freezing as December deepened into January, ice forming in sheets that groaned and cracked in the wind. The Reeves family appeared on local news, then regional broadcasts, Daniel's senior portrait staring out from missing person flyers stapled to telephone poles and taped to gas station windows. His mother, Ellen, gave interviews with red-rimmed eyes, her voice steady only through force of will. His father, Marcus, stopped going to work at the foundry and spent his days walking the same trails over and over, as if repetition might reveal what 100 searchers had missed. Sheriff Galloway kept the case open, but active leads dried up. The statistical window for finding someone alive closed, then the window for finding them at all began to narrow. Theories multiplied in the absence of facts. Some said Daniel had met with foul play, though there were no suspects and no motive anyone could name. Others whispered about suicide, but those who knew him rejected that explanation. Daniel had been accepted to 3 state universities and planned to study environmental engineering. He'd talked about designing water treatment systems for rural communities. He'd had a future he wanted. A few locals, the kind who still believed in things that moved in deep woods and deep water, spoke of older disappearances around the lake, of places where the land itself seemed hungry. Galloway dismissed such talk, but couldn't dismiss the fact that Daniel Reeves had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. If you're still watching, subscribe now to stay with us as the mystery deepens. In the second year, Ellen Reeves learned to navigate bureaucracies most people never encounter. She filed petitions to keep Daniel's case active, organized annual searches on the anniversary of his disappearance, and connected with other families whose children had vanished without trace. She started a foundation, modest at first, that helped fund searches for the missing across 3 counties. Marcus threw himself into a different kind of work, taking courses in wilderness survival and search and rescue protocols, transforming grief into expertise he hoped might save someone else's child. Their marriage held, though it bore the weight of an absence that sat at every meal, every holiday, every moment that should have included their son. They kept his room exactly as he'd left it, his posters on the walls, his books stacked beside the bed, not as a shrine, but as a placeholder for a hope that refused to die even as the years accumulated like sediment. The sheriff's department cycled through 3 deputies who'd worked the case before Galloway himself approached retirement. The lieutenant who would replace him, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd transferred from a city force 200 miles away, spent her first weeks reviewing every cold case in the county files. Daniel's folder had grown thick with reports, witness statements and search logs that documented hundreds of person hours and revealed nothing. Chen read them all twice, making notes in careful handwriting, building mental maps of the terrain and the timeline. She noticed something the others had missed or perhaps not considered significant. 3 days before Daniel disappeared, a geology class from the state university had conducted a field study around the lake, taking soil samples and mapping some of the limestone caves that honeycombed the ridges to the north. The caves were gated, supposedly inaccessible, but Chen knew that gates could be breached and curiosity could be stronger than caution. She requisitioned the university's field records and found the professor's contact information. He remembered the trip, remembered parking at the public access point on the lake's east side, remembered his students fanning out in teams of 2 with GPS units and sample kits. One team had wandered further than intended, following what looked like an old game trail up into the ridge system. They'd found a cave entrance, not one of the known tourist attractions, but something smaller, partially hidden by a rockfall that might have happened decades ago or centuries. The gate here was rusted through, the chain meant to secure it lying in pieces on the ground. The students had taken photos but hadn't entered, mindful of their professor's warnings about unmapped cave systems and bad air. Chen obtained the photos and the GPS coordinates. On a cold morning in March, 11 years after Daniel Reeves walked to the end of that dock, she drove out to the lake with a 3-person spelunking team borrowed from the State Park Service. The cave mouth opened like a wound in the limestone, narrow enough that they had to turn sideways to enter, widening after 20 feet into a chamber the size of a small room. Their helmet lamps swept across walls, streaked with minerals, across formations that grew from floor and ceiling in slow geological time. The cave continued back, a passage sloping downward into darkness that smelled of wet stone and earth. They marked their route with reflective tape and moved deeper, calling out measurements and observations that echoed back distorted. 50 meters in, Chen's light caught something that didn't belong. A water bottle, plastic faded to near white, wedged between 2 rocks. The label was illegible, but the shape was commercial, modern. 20 meters further, they found a wool sock, half buried in silt where water had once flowed, then a rusted carabiner. Then, in a side chamber that required crawling through a gap barely wide enough for shoulders, they found the cache. Someone had lived here, not just sheltered for a night, but lived for weeks or months or longer. A sleeping bag, mildewed and rotting, lay spread across the driest section of floor. Beside it sat a backpack, canvas and leather, its contents protected by multiple layers of plastic bags. a flashlight with corroded batteries, 3 notebooks with water-stained covers, a hand-crank emergency radio still functional when Chen tested it, a first aid kit with most supplies used, packages of dehydrated camping food with dates from 12 years ago, and a mini-DV camcorder in a waterproof case, its tape still loaded. The notebooks were filled with handwriting that started neat and disciplined and gradually loosened into something more urgent, more raw. The dates in the earliest entries began 2 weeks after Daniel Reeves disappeared. The entries ran for 7 months. The signature on the inside cover, written in careful block letters, said Daniel Alexander Reeves, and gave the address of the house by the lake where his parents still waited. Chen sat in the cave chamber with the evidence spread on a tarp and read every page by lamplight while her team documented the scene. The story that emerged was not the one anyone had imagined. Daniel had come to the lake that November morning, not to disappear, but to think, walking further than usual, following deer trails into terrain he thought he knew. He'd found the cave by accident when a sudden storm rolled in, seeking shelter from rain that turned to sleet. He'd gone deeper to escape the wind and taken a wrong turn at a junction in the passage, ending up in a section where the path branched multiple times and his mental map failed him. He'd had a lighter in his pocket, nothing more. No phone, no gear, no compass. He'd tried to find his way out and succeeded only in going deeper, reaching chambers where the air was thin and the silence was absolute. Panic had taken him first, then hypothermia as he burned through his body's resources. He'd passed out in the darkness and woken to the sound of water dripping, colder than he'd ever been, certain he was dying. But Daniel hadn't died. In the notebooks, he described crawling through the blackness, following air currents because air had to come from somewhere, rationing the lighter fluid until the flame wouldn't catch anymore, moving by touch alone through passages that twisted and doubled back. He found the main chamber after 3 days, recognized the opening by the pale grey light that filtered in even on cloudy afternoons. He made it to the entrance and saw the valley below, saw the lake, saw smoke rising from chimneys in town 5 miles away. He tried to descend and discovered what he hadn't noticed on the way up. The trail he'd followed had collapsed in the storm, a section of hillside sheared away, leaving an impassable drop of 40 feet down wet limestone and loose scree. He was trapped above the world he knew, visible to no one, because no one looked up at that particular ridge from that particular angle. The entries documented his choices. He could try to climb down and likely fall. He could wait for rescue that didn't come because no one knew where to look. Or he could survive. He chose survival. He wrote about rationing the granola bars he'd had in his jacket, about collecting rainwater in the cave, about the psychological discipline required to wake each morning with purpose instead of despair. After 2 weeks, he made the first trip back into the cave system, this time mapping as he went, scratching arrows into the limestone with a sharp rock. He found deeper chambers, some with pools of clear water that welled up from underground aquifers. He found evidence that others had used these caves long ago. Initials carved into walls, dated 1892, fragments of a canvas tarp, rotted to threads. Most importantly, he found a passage that led to a second entrance, this one on the far side of the ridge, accessible and unblocked. The cave was survivable. The question was whether he wanted to leave. The crisis came at the 3-month mark. By then, Daniel knew he could walk out. He'd scouted the route, cached food and water at intervals, mapped the path well enough to navigate in darkness if necessary. But 3 months had passed. His family would have held a funeral by now, or at least memorial service. They would have begun the terrible work of learning to live with his absence. If he walked back into their lives, he would be bringing resurrection and all its complications, forcing them to grieve again for the time they'd lost, upending whatever fragile peace they'd constructed. The psychological complexity of this paralyzed him. He wrote page after page, trying to reason through it, building arguments for leaving and counter-arguments for staying, dissecting his own motives with brutal honesty. Was he protecting them or himself? Was this selflessness or cowardice? In the end, he decided to wait until he could explain, until he had something to show for the time that would justify the pain. He would document everything, create a record that proved he'd survived, not through luck, but through choices, through discipline, through becoming someone worthy of the second chance he'd been given. The entries became more sporadic as Daniel established routines. He described trips to the far entrance, always at night, always careful, gathering supplies from a sporting goods store 40 miles away that he reached by hitchhiking rides from truckers who never asked many questions. He stole methodically, taking only what he needed, leaving cash when he could from money saved before his disappearance. He set up the sleeping quarters in the main chamber, the driest and warmest space he could find. He documented the cave system in obsessive detail, filling the second notebook with maps and observations, turning his entrapment into a self-directed research project. He taught himself to navigate without light, memorizing every turn and obstacle. He established caches of food and water throughout the network, insurance against injury or illness. He marked the passing seasons by changes in water flow and temperature, by the animals that denned near the entrance, by the angle of light that penetrated the opening at different times of year. The third notebook shifted in tone. The entries grew shorter, less focused on survival logistics and more on philosophical terrain. Daniel wrestled with identity, with the question of who he was if no one knew he existed. He wrote about his parents, imagining their lives in painful detail, constructing scenarios that sometimes comforted him and sometimes broke him. He described the temptation to return growing stronger and the fear of return growing stronger alongside it. Time had made him a stranger to his own life. The person who might walk out of these caves would not be the 17-year-old who'd entered. He'd changed too much, seen too much of what humans could endure and how thin the line was between civilization and wildness. How could he explain that to people who'd never had to choose between impossible options? The entries stopped abruptly in late June. 7 months after the first one, the notebook fell silent without explanation or conclusion. Chen emerged from the cave with the evidence carefully bagged and her mind racing through implications. The camcorder tape would need to be processed by specialists, but she'd watched enough of it to recognize Daniel's face, older and harder than his missing person photo, speaking directly to the camera about water sources and potential hazards in the deeper passages. The tape was labeled Survey Log June 15 in the same handwriting that filled the notebooks. She called Galloway from the parking area, speaking carefully because what she was about to say sounded impossible, even as evidence weighted her pack. They had found Daniel Reeves. They had found where he'd lived for 7 months. But they had not found Daniel himself, and the trail ended 11 years ago with no explanation for what happened next, or where he'd gone, or whether he'd ever left the ridge alive. If you want to see how this mystery resolves, hit that subscribe button now, because what happens next will shake everything we thought we knew. The video footage ran 90 minutes, all of it recorded in the cave. Daniel's voice echoing off stone as he documented his adapted routines and explained his mapping system. He looked healthy but different, leaner and weather-worn, his hair longer and his eyes holding something harder than teenage uncertainty. He spoke clinically about the cave's resources, about the challenges of maintaining hygiene and health, about the psychological strategies he'd developed to combat isolation. Toward the end of the tape, his tone shifted. He talked about responsibility, about the people searching for him, about the selfishness of staying hidden and the difficulty of facing them after so much time. He said he'd made a decision. He said tomorrow he would walk out, return to town, accept whatever consequences came. The tape ended there, with no indication of whether he'd followed through. Chen organized a comprehensive grid search of the ridge, deploying every available resource across 2 weeks. They found no remains, no evidence of injury or incident, no sign that Daniel had died on the mountain. What they found instead was a pattern of small thefts from stores and gas stations along a route leading east, away from the lake, spanning the months after the last notebook entry. Security camera footage from a truck stop 200 miles away showed someone matching Daniel's description boarding a bus with a duffel bag, destination unclear. The trail went cold in a city large enough to swallow someone who wanted to disappear. Chen built a file of circumstantial evidence suggesting Daniel had left the caves, walked away from his old life, and vanished a second time by choice into the anonymous crowds of urban America. She prepared to close the case, as resolved but unsolvable when the knock came on Galloway's door. It was late evening, October, 11 years and 11 months after Daniel Reeves had walked to the lake. Galloway had retired 2 months earlier and was working on the cabin he'd been building for decades, hands covered in sawdust when he heard the firm, deliberate rapping on the frame of his screen door. He wiped his hands on his jeans and walked through the house, expecting a neighbor or possibly a delivery driver running late. Instead, he found a man standing on the porch, early 30s, weathered and solid, wearing clean clothes that didn't quite fit the season and carrying a worn backpack. The man looked at Galloway for a long moment, his eyes familiar in a way that made the old sheriff's breath catch. The man said his name was Daniel Reeves, said he needed to report a missing persons case, as resolved, said he was ready to come home now if there was still a home to come to. The story Daniel told over the next 3 days, in multiple sessions with Chen and Galloway, with his parents present and then separate, with therapists and lawyers, and eventually reporters, was one of transformation stretched across a decade. He confirmed the notebook's accounts, described the 7 months in the cave, explained the paralysis that had kept him there longer than survival required. He talked about the morning he'd finally walked out, terrified and resolute, making it as far as the highway before the scale of what he was about to do overwhelmed him. He described standing at a payphone with coins in his hand, his mother's number already dialed, the ringing in his ear, and then hanging up before she could answer because he still wasn't ready, still didn't have the words to explain. He'd decided to give himself 1 year to become someone who could face his family, to accomplish something that would justify the time and prove he hadn't wasted it. 1 year became 2, then 5, then 11. Daniel had worked construction under assumed names, saving money and learning skills. He'd taken online courses in environmental science, the field he'd planned to study before the lake. He'd volunteered with wilderness rescue teams, using hard-won expertise to pull other lost people from the places that had almost kept him. He'd built a life in pieces, always temporary, always moving, carrying the weight of his unfinished business, but unable to set it down. The turning point came when his work crew was hired to help with disaster relief after a flood destroyed a small town's water treatment facility. Daniel had designed and helped build a temporary system that kept the town functioning until permanent repairs could be made. The mayor had tried to find out who he really was to commend him properly, and Daniel had realized he was tired of being no one, tired of running from a truth that only grew heavier with distance. He'd made arrangements, tied up loose ends, and finally come back to finish what he'd started that November morning. The reunion with his parents was private, lasting hours, full of tears and careful words, and the slow recognition that the boy they'd lost had become a man they needed to learn. Ellen held her son and felt the decades of grief crack open, releasing something that wasn't quite relief, but closer to closure than she'd dared hope for. Marcus gripped Daniel's hand and didn't let go for a long time, his eyes studying the face he'd dreamed about and searched for and mourned, finding there the echo of the child and the presence of a stranger. They talked about anger and forgiveness, about choices that couldn't be unmade and time that couldn't be recovered. They learned about the life he'd lived in the shadows while they'd lived in the light of not knowing. It wasn't easy. It wasn't simple. But it was real, and that was more than they'd had for 11 years. The media coverage was intense but brief, Daniel's return making headlines for a week before other stories pushed it aside. The sensation lay not in the disappearance itself, but in its resolution, in the fact that someone could vanish so completely by accident, and then by choice, that survival could be more complicated than life or death. Legal proceedings were straightforward. Daniel had committed no major crimes, and there was no criminal case to pursue. His identity was verified through DNA and dental records. His death certificate, issued in absentia after 7 years, was voided. He was resurrected on paper and in life, though both took adjustment. He moved into an apartment near his parents, but not with them, understanding they all needed space to negotiate new relationships. He found work with the county's water management department, putting his self-taught expertise and formal credentials to use. He began speaking to search and rescue groups, sharing lessons learned from both sides of being lost. Ellen and Marcus poured their foundation's resources into improving cave safety and wilderness education, working with the State Park Service to install better signage and emergency caches at trailheads around the lake. They commissioned a study of the cave system where Daniel had survived, leading to its official closure and sealing, except for scientific research purposes. The lake itself remained as it had always been, beautiful and dangerous, holding its secrets in cold depths and keeping faith with none of them. On quiet mornings, Daniel would sometimes drive out there and stand at the end of the old dock, watching mist rise from the water, feeling the particular silence that comes when you're alone with deep water and trees that have stood longer than anyone can remember. He would think about the 17-year-old who'd walked this same path, about the man he'd become in the darkness, about all the versions of himself he'd carried through caves and cities and years. He would remember that survival is rarely about a single moment, but about the accumulation of small choices, each one leading to the next, each one making you into whoever you'll be when you finally find your way home. The story of Daniel Reeves became a case study in search protocols, a footnote in missing person statistics, and a reminder that resolution doesn't always mean closure, and return doesn't always mean ending. It taught law enforcement to expand their search parameters, to consider not just where someone might have gone, but where they might have stayed by accident or design. It taught families to hold both hope and realism, to understand that outcomes can fall between the binary of life and death. Most of all, it demonstrated that the human capacity for adaptation and survival extends beyond physical endurance into psychological terrain, into the question of identity itself, into the choice of who we become when circumstances strip away everything familiar and leave us alone with only ourselves for company. Daniel had vanished twice, once into the earth and once into the world, and his return shocked, not because it was impossible, but because it made everyone who heard the story question what they would do in his place, whether they would find their way back or choose to remain lost, whether home is a place we return to or something we rebuild every day from the materials at hand. The lake still lies flat and silver under the sky, its surface reflecting nothing but light and weather, keeping whatever other secrets it holds for another day, another disappearance, another story not yet written.